Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, we examined the relationship between Alberton chemical spill victims and the doctors who treated them, or who served as witnesses against them in litigation. We now continue with Part 6, Chapter 7, Sensitive Conclusions. Epigraph: Shoved into the cracks. For Alberton victims, a key health issue was whether doctors and health officials recognized their exposures could cause chronic illness such as RADS and MCS. Sensitivity or hypersensitivity, generally used interchangeably, which could be triggered by any number of chemicals, made it possibly irrelevant whether or not people had been exposed to more than chlorine. Dr. Cynthia Lewis Younger broadly defended the health response to the Alberton exposures. I could not locate one study that says an acute exposure ended up with chronic effects, she said. In fact, there was evidence even in the pre-RADS term era documenting chronic effects from acute chlorine exposure, including sensitivity. Then, in 1985, Brooks established that acute exposure to an irritant, including chlorine, could lead to RADS. Several later pre-Alberton studies suggested development of chronic reactive airways following acute chlorine exposure. Studies were also replete with warnings that little was known with certainty, in part because so few studies had been done. In 1996, ATSDR was aware of such information. MCS was also fairly well established as a syndrome by the time of the Alberton spill. There were ample reasons to inform victims that they might develop RADS and chronic hypersensitivity and experience a range of chronic problems, and to track this in victims. Instead, many spill victims with chronic complaints felt ignored, disbelieved, and marginalized by government agencies and health providers. Yet, the EPA eventually told the Inspector General that they had sufficiently warned victims about the effects of chlorine, including hypersensitivity. But the EPA only acknowledged short-term hypersensitivity during the evacuation period, following victims' early complaints regarding motel swimming pools. Officials assured evacuees that the vast majority of spill victims should have no chronic illness, and any hypersensitivity would last at most 6 to 8 weeks. Government health agencies failed to investigate and respond to residents' complaints of chronic illness. The public record revealed the official warnings about hypersensitivity and chronic health effects. Advice first appeared reactionary as residents complained of reactions to motel pools and during visits to the exclusion zone. The recognition of sensitivity or hypersensitivity by health officials evolved as complaints surfaced, but sensitivity was considered a temporary effect. Sensitivity symptoms were generally presented as nonspecific and vague in handouts preparing residents to return home. A separate advisory made no mention at all of sensitivity. Officials, doctors, and MRL maintained throughout the evacuation period that most people would recover fully. In early May 1996, pulmonologist Drs. William Beckemeyer and Paul Lunan met some 300 Alberton area residents and repeated the consensus, as quoted in the Missoulian, that in the great majority of cases, people who have been exposed to chlorine gas will completely recover. Lung tissue will repair itself and lung function improves, usually within a matter of weeks. Smokers and people with prior lung problems might face more difficulty, but chlorine really doesn't leave people with chronic problems, Beckemeyer reassured. As reported, the doctors made no reference to sensitivity. The public record of media reports, incident documents, and video recordings reflected that information on reactive airways disease, asthmatic-like symptoms, and sensitivity comprised a handful of interactions and publications, much of it resulting from prodding questions by the spill victims. The term MCS, or multiple chemical sensitivity, never arose. The overriding message was full recovery. A detailed expert presentation on sensitivity issues was never given. Notably, while any sensitivity information came mainly in response to residents' questions, open questions were often discouraged during the evacuee meetings. Was this approach sufficient to prepare anyone for a life of chronic illness? after the Alberton spill? The archived record made public almost a year after the spill revealed the behind-the-scenes discussions on hypersensitivity. Health officials knew that residents reported chlorine and pesticide odors during visits to the exclusion zone, as well as symptoms when they returned for limited visits. Officials understood that pesticide-like odors and mercaptans were associated with the spilled potassium cresylate and chlorinated compounds, and that the odors were extremely strong and human noses very sensitive to them, even for people not sensitized. While considering the criteria for final reentry, officials decided that hypersensitivity would not be a criterion for consideration. They understood that any established hypersensitivity could be now triggered by various chemicals. Officials knew that hypersensitivity symptoms could include dermal, ocular, respiratory irritation, as well as headaches and nausea. Ellen Leahy of the Health Department, Chris Weiss of the EPA, Todd Damrow of the State Health Department, and representatives of ATSDR internally discussed RADS. Officials noted that the contaminated soil odor will be a problem. They understood that ongoing chlorine and cresylate odors caused verifiable symptoms, and that people now sensitized were much more easily triggered into recurring symptoms by subsequent exposures. During the key 2-hour conference call on April 21, a few local doctors and hospital officials, as well as toxicologists from the advisory Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center, joined the discussion on hypersensitivity. Dr. Lunan, though he noted significant symptoms upon residents' home visits, did not believe in multiple chemical sensitivity, and in this conference referenced psychological overlay and pre-existing conditions to help account for symptoms. Because of these concerns, the consensus group wanted the soil removed from the area before reentry as a criterion. According to Leahy, it would be left to residents to tell doctors about any hypersensitivity. The health department would not be talking to area doctors about sensitivity issues, she said. Hypersensitivity would not be a criterion, but a proviso was that if a, quote, bunch of people with obvious rashes or PFT changes reported symptoms upon reentry, then the consensus groups would reconvene to consider the problem. However, there was no apparent tracking of such information. This key conference, as well as other log meetings, confirmed that officials believed that returning to the Alberton area made some residents feel sick. The sickness itself, however, and hypersensitivity was greatly discounted and not considered a public health threat. Health officials later backtracked on removal of the contaminated soil from the site at the behest of the EPA's Steve Way because of the protocol for removal. With some mitigation measures for the stored soil after excavation, Way thought the soil not a health hazard. The odor of the cresylate does not present a health issue, he said. On April 28, the day of full reentry, Dr. Koken of the Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center sent 2 final updates to the health department, reaffirming that most people would recover completely. The bulletins made no mention per se of hypersensitivity to chlorine or other chemicals, though one warned, quote, that people returning to areas close to the spill may notice a residual odor. Some may experience nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and headache related to the odor. These symptoms would be expected to resolve with removal to fresh air. The health department did not publicize the bulletins. These behind-the-scenes discussions emphasized sensitivity issues much more so than the public discussions, but the result was the same. Already considered temporary by officials and participating doctors, any hypersensitivity for residents had been mainly wedded to the contaminated soil, which would eventually be removed. Leahy said later that Dr. Dart, a medical toxicologist with the Poison Control Center, told her there will be people that can go on to have a hypersensitivity forever, to certain chemicals, to certain substances. No official ever made such a statement to the public. During the key conference call, Leahy had noted that sensitivity can be triggered by other chemicals. Leahy recalled she was concerned people might have sensitivity to chlorine, chemicals in the cresylate, or other chemicals in general, both acutely and in the long term. She believed in multiple chemical sensitivity. Leahy acknowledged that no official warned victims that they might develop multiple chemical sensitivity per se. There was no documentation of any effort to determine how many people reacted to the environment upon return, which might have caused reconsideration of a public health threat, a reconvening of the consensus group. Weiss recalled, "We knew that people were hypersensitive. We were hearing reports not only from individuals, but also from physicians, indicating that they were observing some hypersensitivity, and they expected hypersensitivity. We knew that was going to happen." But Weiss said no one favored making hypersensitivity a criterion. Yeah, it wouldn't really have made sense to have to keep people out of their homes because of reactive hypersensitivity, he said. Once someone was sensitized, they're going to be sensitized. Preventing them from going back to their home wouldn't really have helped. This would make sense if people were going back to an otherwise neutral environment. They could have exposures to various triggers anywhere. But it was clear that many residents were having reactions specifically and strongly to the environment in which they had suffered their acute exposure, and to apparent spill chemicals and odors that now lingered. Some residents' sensitivity drove them from their homes. Weiss added, "You can be hypersensitive to chemicals without having multiple chemical sensitivity. You could be hypersensitive to chlorine, for example, without being sensitive to multiple chemicals." But if residents had been hypersensitive mainly to spilled chemicals, this seemed all the more reason to protect them from any residual exposure upon return. Leahy said it was up to residents to tell doctors about any hypersensitivity. She did not suggest the health department talk to area doctors about sensitivity issues. Weiss, on the other hand, did recall an effort to inform local doctors about hypersensitivity. "We wanted to make sure that the physician community was aware of what we knew." Weiss said Leahy was very involved with this and that hypersensitivity and RADS were discussed with local doctors. But apparently the discussions did not involve many local doctors. Pulmonologist Dr. Lunan appeared to be the main contact. Lunan did not believe in multiple chemical sensitivity. Weiss said Leahy made the local contacts, acknowledging that not too many local doctors were involved. "Most of these guys were really busy," he said. I think that was probably more the case where Dr. Lunan was the spokesperson for the other docs in the hospital and played that role to share that information. If Dr. Lunan was a point man for local outreach about chronic issues such as hypersensitivity, it did not ring a bell with Lunan. I don't recall that I had a discussion with an EPA toxicologist about long-term effects, he said, in 1997. It appeared there was little, if any, meaningful outreach to local doctors about sensitivity issues. Many Alberton spill victims said one of the obstacles they faced was getting doctors to recognize various hypersensitivity symptoms as being related to the spill exposure. Poorly informed themselves about hypersensitivity, spill victims were left to supposedly inform local doctors about an issue nobody knew much about. Sensitivity issues were downplayed. Officials made no reference to medical literature that showed that hypersensitivity, multiple chemical sensitivity, or RADS, the latter two terms never used publicly, could be permanent among people who received even a non-severe exposure to an irritant. By general re-entry, officials had not publicly estimated the percentage of people that might experience hypersensitivity, hadn't clearly detailed the possible symptoms, hadn't given any health suggestions in treating sensitivity, but assured it would be temporary, and had not made clear if the reactions people reported were from spill-related exposures, chlorine and other sources such as treated water, other triggers, or all of these. Officials chose not to impart certain reasonable messages, such as, returning home may make you sick because of sensitivity. You may feel sensitized and sick indefinitely, regardless of returning home. Leahy's handouts had warned of residual chlorine possibly being around, though Weiss thought it highly unlikely, because we always take pretty big precautions, give precautionary statements, Leahy claimed. But there was no such precautionary statement about sensitivity to returning home, though people reported sensitivity. Did health officials have the responsibility to at least communicate to those already reporting sensitivity reactions, you may never be able to return? Well, Leahy said, that would have been huge speculation on my part to say, you may never be able to return. I had no way of determining that. But for those having these health problems, nobody knew when they were going to end. No, she agreed, nobody does. But no one was telling them this could go on indefinitely. We don't know. I wouldn't make a blanket statement to them because I don't know. So you've got a mixed population, everything from kids to people that are older to people that have lung problems. You just couldn't make a blanket statement like that. And so there was no big precautionary statement to the public about sensitivity issues, except the blanket statement that sensitivity should be temporary, even though Dr. Dart, a medical toxicologist, had told Leahy there will be people that can go on to have a hypersensitivity forever. A warning Leahy did not share with spill victims. After re-entry in early May, the Missoulian reported on Randy Crisco's noting a wheat and feed smell at his home when he returned, which triggered immediate headaches and respiratory distress and vomiting in himself and his son. Were others having this reaction upon coming home? There was no investigation by the health department or EPA and no media inquiry. The incident was significant enough to drive this family permanently from their rental home. In mid-May, Montana DEQ knew that Plum Creek workers in the area complained of headaches, and these workers presumably had not been exposed prior and sensitized. This health complaint went unpublicized, as later would the meter readers' complaints. By intent or neglect, DEQ's Tom Ellerhoff buried the information, despite that it would have helped validate the complaints of residents. On May 29, reporter Alika Rutland briefly reported on more residents claiming that returning to Alberton made them feel ill. Lucinda Hodges said that after returning to Alberton for an ACE meeting, her burning skin and eyes forced her out of town, back to her Missoula motel. She felt allergic to Alberton, she said. No officials reacted publicly to any post-reentry complaints. No one tracked how many people were having problems going home. By July, the Missoulian declared most people completely recovered. A few have lingering problems. But the cessation of media coverage didn't mean that chronic health issues such as hypersensitivity in RADs had disappeared. An unknown number of people, unknown because no one investigated, still had chronic illness and serious sensitivity, reacting both to the soil before it was removed and to the site and general environment even afterwards, as well as to other triggers. When the spring thaw of 1997 released a fresh wave of chemical off-gassing from the site, many people experienced a resurgence in their illness, which led to civil protests during the first anniversary. Spill-related smells continued on and off for years, while members of ACCEH complained to the EPA and ATSDR of chronic illness. But despite this evidence suggesting hypersensitivity was permanent for many residents and related, at least in part, to the Alberton environment, neither the EPA, ATSDR, Montana DEQ, the Missoula City County Health Department, or local doctors ever stepped up publicly to validate the complaints. Hypersensitivity, multiple chemical sensitivity, reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, these concepts were not part of official public discourse after reentry. Neither did the local media investigate. Health complaints, including sensitivity, would continue for many people indefinitely, even among those presumed to not be severely exposed, and the symptoms were often severe. When residents complained of having reactions to the Alberton environment or various irritants months or years down the road, neither the EPA nor ATSDR nor local health officials recognized or addressed the most likely conclusion. People had developed chronic illness that indicated chemical sensitivity, including RADs. Arguably, the majority of chronic health complaints arising from the spill exposure related to hypersensitivity, but many residents struggled to find acceptance of a hypersensitivity diagnosis from medical practitioners and get help in treatment. Residents suffering from sensitivity felt left on their own, receiving little helpful response from government agencies and health officials. When official assumptions about chronic health effects were contradicted, logic dictated a reassessment. Such did not occur. The marginalization of Alberton victims suffering chronic illness was complete. Like Libby sufferers, they felt shoved into the cracks. Officials failed to bring in an environmental illness expert to present sensitivity issues to evacuees, both in preparation for reentry and afterward when residents reported ongoing illness. Such a public presentation was the least officials could have done, and it would have served to educate spill victims and the greater community, including healthcare providers if effectively covered by the media. After re-entry, instead of acknowledging and publicizing sensitivity issues, officials ignored it and passed the buck to ATSDR, who wouldn't report any findings for years. ATSDR then failed to implement their own MCS questionnaire protocol to document the prevalence of sensitivity among Alberton spill victims. While the EPA and OIG vaguely claim they had sufficiently informed Alberton spill victims about chlorine health issues, in the aftermath of re-entry, sensitivity complaints were ignored, and ATSDR chose to learn nothing about chemical sensitivity from the Alberton spill. People suffering chronic illness who had settled quickly were left to fend for themselves, and those that didn't settle wanted their day in court. The lack of official validation undermined claims of chronic illness in litigation, where arguments came down to testimony by treating doctors and paid medical experts, and the literature. In the majority of Alberton legal cases, medical claims generally included many symptoms likely related to hypersensitivity. But in general, plaintiff lawyers avoided making a specific claim of hypersensitivity or MCS per se, perhaps fearful of medical controversy. One exception was RADS, which by definition was a sensitivity illness. Of the 3 cases that went to trial, Edgar emphasized chronic eye damage. Austin, who had a prehistory of asthma, emphasized chronically aggravated asthma. And the Walshes claimed a variety of chronic illness, including RADS. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, the final piece in the medical case for Alberton spill victims considers evidence for neurological or brain damage from chlorine. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.